I was 51 years old when the doctor stopped looking at the chart and finally looked at me. That's how I knew something was wrong. We were sitting in a small exam room at St. Luke's Medical Center in Denver, the kind of place that smells like disinfectant and burnt coffee. My son, Ethan, was beside me, swinging his legs slightly because the chair was too tall for him. He was 13 then, skinny, sharp-eyed, too serious for his age. Had been sick for months. Fatigue. Pain. Bruises that came out of nowhere. We told ourselves it was growing pains. Stress. School. Anything but the truth. The doctor cleared his throat. Mr. Harris, he said, carefully, we've run every test available to us. I nodded, pretending I already understood what was coming. There's no cure, he continued. We can manage symptoms. Slow progression. But this is permanent. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just stared at the poster on the wall showing a smiling cartoon heart lifting weights. I remember thinking how cruel that poster was. As if willpower alone could fix what biology had decided to break. I asked the only question a father can ask in that moment. How long? The doctor hesitated. That hesitation did more damage than any word could. It varies, he said. Years. Maybe more. Maybe less. We walked out of the hospital into the thin Colorado sunlight, and I remember the strangest thought crossing my mind. The world didn't stop. That feels wrong. On the drive home, Ethan finally spoke. Am I going to die, Dad? I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Not today, I said. And not tomorrow. And as long as I'm breathing, you're not doing this alone. He nodded, like a grown man accepting a business deal he didn't like but had no choice but to sign. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table in our small house on the edge of Aurora. Bills spread out in front of me. Mortgage. Insurance. Medical estimates that already looked like phone numbers. I worked as a senior operations manager at a logistics company downtown. 15 years. Long hours. No shortcuts. I climbed every rung the hard way. I told myself I could handle this. Men like me always do. For a while, I was right. I negotiated flexible hours. Took calls from hospital waiting rooms. Learned how to read lab results like a second language. I cooked more. Slept less. Smiled when Ethan was watching and broke quietly when he wasn't. But life doesn't care how strong you think you are. 6 months later, the company was acquired. Nothing personal, my new supervisor said, not meeting my eyes. Restructuring. We're going in a different direction. Different direction. 2 words that erased my paycheck, my insurance, and the illusion of control I'd been clinging to. I boxed up 15 years of my life in a cardboard container with a broken handle. As I walked out of that glass building for the last time, I remember thinking how light the box felt. That should have scared me more. Unemployment didn't wait politely. Neither did the bills. Medical expenses piled up like snowdrifts. I sold my truck. Then my tools. Then the watch my father gave me when I turned 30. I told myself they were just things. And they were. But they were earned things. Pieces of proof that I'd built something once. Ethan noticed, of course. You don't have to pretend, Dad, he said one night when I tried to laugh off a late notice taped to the door. I'm not pretending, I replied. He looked at me with eyes far older than 13. Yes, you are. The bank called in the loan 3 months later. That was the night I sat on the floor of the living room, no furniture left except a couch we'd had since Ethan was a toddler, and finally admitted the word I'd been avoiding. Bankrupt. I filed the paperwork with hands that didn't shake, which surprised me. I'd always imagined bankruptcy would feel like panic or shame. Instead, it felt like exhaustion. The deep kind. The kind that seeps into your bones and tells you to stop fighting gravity. We moved into a small rental on the other side of town. Cheaper. Smaller. No yard. Ethan didn't complain once. That hurt more than if he had. One evening, as I lay awake listening to the radiator knock like it was trying to escape the wall, a thought came to me, quiet, dangerous, tempting. Maybe this is it. Maybe I was done. Maybe my best years were behind me. Maybe all I had left was damage control. Survival. Getting Ethan through whatever time he had with as little pain as possible. That thought stayed with me for weeks. Then one night, after Ethan fell asleep on the couch with a book on his chest, I stepped outside onto the narrow balcony. The city lights of Denver flickered in the distance. Cars moved. People lived. Somewhere, someone was celebrating something. Somewhere else, someone was losing everything. I realized something then. I wasn't afraid of being poor. I was afraid of becoming small. Of shrinking into a man who accepted defeat quietly and called it realism. And that scared me more than bankruptcy ever could. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote a plan. Not a dream. Not a fantasy. A plan. Real numbers. Skills I had. Gaps I needed to fill. Industries that didn't care about sums as much as results. I studied at night. Took free courses. Learned things men my age usually say they're too old to learn. I didn't tell anyone. Not Ethan. Not friends. Hope is fragile when spoken too early. But somewhere between medical appointments and late-night spreadsheets, something inside me shifted. I wasn't fighting to get my old life back anymore. I was building a new one. And I had no idea yet how expensive that decision was going to be. The rental apartment had thin walls and a stubborn radiator that knocked all night like it was reminding me I hadn't paid it off yet. Ethan slept in the bedroom. I took the couch. That wasn't a sacrifice, I wanted to be close in case he needed me at night. The pain came without warning sometimes. Sharp. Ruthless. I learned to wake up before he cried out. Mornings became routine. Wake up early. Make oatmeal. Check emails that never came. Drive Ethan to school in a borrowed sedan that smelled like someone else's life. Smile. Always smile. I applied for jobs like it was my second full-time occupation. Operations. Management. Consulting. Anything with words that used to describe me. The replies, when they came, were polite and hollow. Overqualified. Not the right fit. We're moving in a different direction. I stopped counting rejections after 47. What I didn't stop counting were the pills. The co-pays. The days Ethan missed school because his body wouldn't cooperate. The nights he apologized for being sick, which nearly broke me in half every time. One evening, as I was sorting through paperwork at the kitchen table, Ethan watched me quietly for a long time. "Dad," he said, "are we okay?" That word. Okay. It was doing a lot of work. "We are," I said. "Just adjusting." He nodded, then surprised me. "You don't have to be strong all the time." I looked at him, really looked at him. 13 years old, shoulders already carrying more than they should. "I know," I said. "But I want to be." That night, after he went to bed, I opened my laptop and stared at the plan I'd written weeks earlier. Skills. Numbers. Industries. One line stared back at me harder than the rest. Stop trying to be hired. Start trying to build. ID spent my life inside other people's systems. Making them more efficient. More profitable. More resilient. ID never owned the outcome, just improved it. So I started small. I reached out to a former vendor ID worked with years earlier. Offered to help streamline his warehouse operations for a fraction of what a firm would charge. He hesitated. I didn't blame him. I had no website. No brand. Just experience and a calm voice on the phone. Give me 2 weeks, I said. If you don't see improvement, you don't owe me a thing. He agreed. Those 2 weeks nearly killed me. I worked nights after Ethan fell asleep. Built spreadsheets. Modeled workflows. Found inefficiencies that had been hiding in plain sight for years. When I walked him through the changes, he stared at the numbers in silence. This saves me how much? He asked. Conservatively. I said. 6 figures annually. He paid me the next day. It wasn't much by corporate standards, but when I deposited that first check, my hands shook. Not from fear. From recognition. I could still create value. Word spread slowly. 1 client became 2. 2 became 4. I undercharged at first, not because I lacked confidence, but because I needed momentum more than money. Reputation compounds faster than revenue. But life wasn't done testing me. Ethan's condition worsened that winter. More hospital visits. More time off school. One night, after a particularly bad episode, he looked at me through glassy eyes and whispered, "I'm tired, Dad." That scared me more than anything the doctors had ever said. I sat beside his bed long after he fell asleep, listening to the machines hum. I thought about the plan. The clients. The fragile progress. And for the first time, I felt real temptation. The kind that doesn't look like weakness, it looks like relief. I could stop. Take disability. Lower expectations. Live smaller. No one would blame me. That thought stayed with me for days. Then, one afternoon, Ethan asked if he could come with me to a client site. He said he was bored of hospitals and wanted to see where Dad's brain goes during the day. I almost said no. Then I said yes. He sat quietly in the corner of that warehouse, hoodie pulled tight, watching forklifts move like chess pieces. On the drive home, he was quiet. Too quiet. Did I mess something up? I asked. He shook his head. I just didn't know you could build things out of nothing, he said. I swallowed hard. Most things worth building start that way, I replied. That night, he taped a piece of paper above the couch where I slept. He didn't say anything about it. When I noticed it later, it read. Keep going. Something hardened inside me then. Not anger. Not pride. Resolve. I raised my rates. Started saying no to bad clients. Reinvested every dollar into tools, learning, and systems. I stopped chasing work and started choosing it. The bank account grew slowly, then steadily. I wasn't rich. But I wasn't drowning anymore. And for the first time since that exam room in Denver, I believed something dangerous and powerful. This story wasn't over. Momentum is a strange thing. When you finally feel it, you're afraid to touch it too hard, like it might disappear if you acknowledge it out loud. By spring, I had more work than I could comfortably handle. 3 regular clients. 2 projects in progress. 1 potential contract that would have sounded impossible just a year earlier. I was still working from our small kitchen table, laptop balanced between medical paperwork and overdue utility notices that hadn't yet realized they were losing their power over me. Money was coming in, not enough to relax, but enough to breathe. Ethan was having better weeks, then worse ones. The doctors adjusted medications. We learned new routines. I learned how to read his face the way sailors read the sky, subtle signs that told me when a storm was coming. One afternoon, after a long client call, I noticed Ethan standing in the doorway watching me. "You look different," he said. "Different how?" "Like busy in a good way." I smiled. That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me all week. He hesitated, then asked, "Are you winning?" The question caught me off guard. "Winning what?" "Life," he said simply. I thought about it for a moment. About the couch I still slept on. The debt I wasn't fully out of yet. The fear that still visited me at night. "I'm still playing," I said. "That counts." He nodded, satisfied. The call that changed everything came 2 weeks later. A regional distribution company had been bleeding money for years and couldn't figure out why. Someone I'd helped earlier had mentioned my name. They didn't want theory. They wanted results. And they wanted someone who wouldn't sugarcoat the truth. I drove to their facility early on a Tuesday morning, the sun barely up. The building was old. The systems older. The people tired. I recognized the look immediately. It was the look of a place that had stopped believing things could improve. By noon, I knew exactly where the problem was. By 5, I had a plan. By the end of the week, they offered me a contract worth more than I'd made in my last year at my old job. I sat in my car afterward, engine off, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. I should have felt joy. Instead, I felt fear. Because this wasn't survival money. This was build a future money. And building a future meant risk. Scaling meant hiring. Hiring meant responsibility. Responsibility meant the possibility of failure that could hurt other people, not just me. That night, Ethan had a rough episode. Pain that wouldn't settle. We ended up back at the hospital, the familiar halls greeting us like old acquaintances. I sat in a plastic chair while he slept, watching monitors flicker, thinking about contracts and cash flow and how absurd it all felt in that moment. What good was momentum if I lost him? The thought lodged deep and ugly. For the first time since I'd started climbing out of the hole, I considered stopping again. Keeping things small. Safe. Manageable. The next morning, Ethan surprised me. "Dad," he said, his voice still thin but steady, "you should take the big job." I looked at him. "How do you know about that?" "You talk in your sleep," he said. Then, more serious. "And because you don't get that look unless it matters." I hesitated. "It means more work. More stress." He shrugged slightly. "You're already stressed. At least let it be for something. Kids have a way of cutting straight through your excuses." I signed the contract. The next 6 months were the hardest Eve ever worked in my life. I hired one person. Then another. Built systems instead of just solving problems. Learned the painful difference between being good at something and being responsible for it. There were days I felt 10 feet tall. There were nights I sat on the balcony again, city lights flickering, wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. Ethan's health fluctuated. Some weeks were good enough that we joked about future road trips. Other weeks were quiet and heavy, the kind where time slows down and you don't dare plan too far ahead. One evening, as I was reviewing payroll, I realized something startling. I was no longer afraid of the bills. Not completely. But the fear no longer owned me. Then life reminded me it still could. The call came from the hospital while I was in the middle of a presentation. I stepped outside to answer it, already knowing from the tone of the nurse's voice that this wasn't routine. "We need you to come in," she said. "Now." I don't remember the drive. Only the way my hands shook when I pushed through the doors. The way the doctor's face softened before he spoke. Complications. Unexpected. Aggressive. We sat together in silence afterward, Ethan and I, the room dim and too quiet. "I'm scared," he said finally. I took his hand. "So am I said. "But listen to me. No matter what happens, you didn't stop me. You didn't ruin anything. You gave me something to fight for." He squeezed my hand weakly. "Then don't quit," he said. Even if things change." That was the night I understood the real cost of momentum. It wasn't time. Or money. Or sleep. It was the knowledge that you don't get to choose what you're building around. Only what you build through. Weeks later, Ethan stabilized again. Not cured. Not safe. But steady. And something else happened quietly in the background. The company grew. Referrals multiplied. Bigger clients came calling. The work ID once begged for now had to be scheduled months out. I raised prices again. Then again. One afternoon, reviewing accounts, I realized something that made me laugh out loud. On paper, I was officially a millionaire. Net worth. Assets. Equity. The word felt unreal. Almost offensive, considering where we still were emotionally. Considering the machines in the hospital rooms and the uncertainty that never left. But it was true. I closed the laptop and sat there, letting it settle. Not triumph. Perspective. ID lost everything once. ID rebuilt while carrying something fragile and irreplaceable. And ID learned that success doesn't erase pain, it just gives you room to stand while you carry it. That night, I went home, made Ethan's favorite simple dinner, and we ate quietly. "You know," he said between bites, "you still sleep on the couch." I smiled. "Old habits. You don't have to anymore." I looked around the small apartment. At the thin walls. The borrowed furniture. "No," I said softly. "But I remember why I did." And I knew then that whatever came next, whatever part of the story I didn't get to write, I had already become someone I could live with. Becoming a millionaire didn't feel like crossing a finish line. It felt like standing in a quiet room after a long argument, realizing the argument wasn't the problem. The money solved practical things fast. We moved out of the apartment within a month, not into anything flashy, just a modest house closer to the hospital. First floor bedroom for Ethan. Wide doorways. Soft light. A kitchen where I could cook without bumping into walls that remembered better days. I paid off old debts without ceremony. Closed accounts. Cleaned up loose ends. I hired help for the company so I could stop being everywhere at once. On paper, life improved dramatically. In reality, the hardest season was just beginning. Ethan's condition didn't care about balance sheets. Some days he felt strong enough to sit on the porch and argue with me about sports he could no longer play. Other days, the pain pinned him to the bed, his jaw tight, eyes closed, breathing measured like he was negotiating with his own body. I learned how to sit in silence properly. Not the awkward kind, the kind where you're waiting for the other person to speak. The real kind. The kind where you're present without trying to fix anything. One evening, while the sun dropped behind the houses across the street, Ethan broke the silence. "Dad," he said, "do you ever think about what you'd do if I wasn't sick?" The question landed heavier than he intended. "I think about it sometimes," I admitted. "But not in the way you think." "How then?" "I think about who I would have become without this," I said. "And I don't think I like that version of me as much." He turned his head slightly to look at me. "That's messed up," he said. "Yeah," I smiled. "It kind of is. The truth was uncomfortable but solid. Before all this, I measured myself by output. Titles. Numbers. Progress. Ethan's illness stripped that away piece by piece until all that was left was presence. And presence changes a man. The company continued to grow without me forcing it. Systems replaced chaos. People stepped into roles they were good at. I learned the discipline of letting go, of trusting others to carry weight without hovering over them. For the first time, success didn't require me to bleed for it daily. Then came the call I'd been quietly preparing for but never fully ready to receive. The doctor's voice was calm. Too calm. We sat in the same room where this had started years earlier. Different charts. Same look. Progression. Irreversible. No clear timeline. Ethan listened carefully, asked practical questions, nodded when answers weren't comforting. He was 15 now, but he carried himself like someone much older. On the drive home, he stared out the window. "You know," he said finally, "I'm not mad anymore." "About what?" "About being sick." I waited. "I think this was just my life," he said. "Not fair or unfair. Just mine." That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room and felt something crack, not break, just split open. Grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet acceptance settling into your bones. I adjusted everything after that. Work became secondary. Always. I cut travel. Declined opportunities that would have taken me too far away. I made sure every day had at least one normal thing: dinner together, a short walk, a shared joke that wasn't about medicine. And slowly, something unexpected happened. Peace moved in. Not happiness. Not relief. Peace. Ethan started writing. Short stories at first. Then longer ones. He said it helped him organize thoughts that didn't like being spoken out loud. I read them only when he offered. Never pushed. One afternoon, he handed me a few pages and said, "This one's about you." I waited until he left the room before reading. It wasn't flattering. It was honest. About a man who thought strength meant never stopping, then learned strength could also mean staying. About a father who failed in 100 ways and showed up anyway. I didn't cry. But I kept the pages. As summer turned into fall, the inevitable approached gently, like it didn't want to startle us. More time at home. Less energy. Conversations that drifted toward memory instead of plans. One night, as I tucked him in, he looked at me with that steady gaze I'd come to respect more than anything. "You did good," he said. I swallowed. "You're not allowed to say that yet." He smiled faintly. "Someone has to." When the end came, it wasn't dramatic. No speeches. No final revelations. Just a quiet morning. Soft light. His hand in mine. I stayed. I stayed even after the room felt too empty to justify breathing. I stayed because leaving felt wrong. Afterward, the house felt enormous. Too clean. Too still. Grief tried to swallow me whole. But it didn't. Because grief wasn't new anymore. I took time away from everything. Let others run the business. Let the world keep spinning without my permission. I walked. I sat. I remembered. And slowly, I understood something important. Money had given me space, but meaning had given me direction. Months later, I returned to work differently. Not hungry. Not desperate. Intentional. I funded programs quietly. Mentored young operators who reminded me of who I used to be, brilliant, driven, and convinced life was something to be conquered. I never corrected them. Life teaches on its own schedule. One evening, sitting on the porch alone, I realized something surprising. I wasn't empty. I missed him every day. That would never change. But I wasn't hollow. Because love, when carried properly, doesn't disappear. It integrates. And for the first time since the beginning of this story, I wasn't running from the pain, or trying to outwork it. I was standing beside it. And that made all the difference. The house stayed quiet long after Ethan was gone. Not empty, quiet. There's a difference. Empty suggests something missing. Quiet suggests something finished speaking. I kept the room the same for a while. Not as a shrine, not out of denial, just respect. His books stayed where he left them. The chair by the window remained turned slightly toward the light, like he might come back and need it. People worried about me. Friends checked in. Business partners tiptoed around conversations, afraid to say the wrong thing to the man who'd lost his son. I never corrected them. I didn't lose him. I carried him forward. Work resumed slowly. The company no longer needed me in the trenches. It was healthy, profitable, and run by people I trusted, people I'd chosen not just for competence, but for character. That had been Ethan's influence, even if he never knew it. I moved into a smaller place eventually. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. Fewer rooms. Less echo. More intention. I sold the house quietly and set aside most of the money without touching it. Wealth stopped feeling like something to use and started feeling like something to steward. I began showing up in places no one expected me. Community colleges. Trade schools. Small-town business workshops where people still believed grit mattered more than jargon. I talked about systems, yes, but more about resilience. About failure that doesn't make headlines. About rebuilding when applause is gone. I never mentioned the numbers. They didn't need them. One night, after a long drive back from a talk in a town barely big enough to have a stoplight, I pulled over at a diner just off the highway. Same kind of place Ethan and I used to stop at after appointments, vinyl booths, bad coffee, honest food. The waitress asked what I did for a living. I thought about it for a second. I build things, I said. She nodded like that made perfect sense. Years passed that way. The company crossed milestones I never celebrated publicly. 8 figures. National expansion. Acquisitions I once would have dreamed about. I signed papers calmly, without the rush I used to mistake for ambition. Money had become quiet too. What replaced it was clarity. I started a foundation, not with my name on it, not with press releases. It focused on families dealing with long-term illness, especially parents forced to choose between being present and being solvent. I knew that impossible choice too well. Sometimes, I'd sit in the back of a room during meetings, watching parents argue over logistics and funding and timelines, and I'd recognize the look in their eyes. The look that says, I don't care how this ends, I just don't want to fail them. I never spoke first. I listened. One evening, sorting through old boxes I'd been carrying from place to place, I found Ethan's writing again. The pages had yellowed slightly. His handwriting still uneven, still earnest. I read the last line again. Strength isn't what you survive. It's what you refuse to abandon while surviving. He was right. I realized then that success hadn't come after the pain. It had been shaped by it. The bankruptcy taught me humility. The illness taught me presence. The loss taught me permanence. And the wealth? It taught me restraint. Years later, a young man approached me after a talk. Late 20s. Sharp suit. Nervous energy. How do you know when you've made it? He asked. I looked at him for a long moment. When your life no longer needs to prove anything, I said. And you still wake up willing to give. He wrote that down. I hoped he wouldn't understand it too soon. On the anniversary of Ethan's passing, I go somewhere quiet. Not a cemetery. Not a hospital. Somewhere ordinary. A park bench. A roadside overlook. A place where life keeps happening without permission. I sit. I breathe. I remember. And I take inventory, not of money, not of accomplishments, but of alignment. Am I still the man who stayed? Am I still building the right things? Am I still carrying him properly? The answer, so far, has been yes. I was once a man who thought success would save him. Then I was a man who thought love would destroy him. I ended up learning that neither was true. What saved me was responsibility. What sustained me was meaning. Everything else was just noise. And if there's one thing I know now, one thing I'd say quietly to any man standing where I once stood, it's this. You don't become rich when you make $1 million, you become rich when life takes everything from you, and you still choose to stand up with your hands open.